I'm truly amazed by the ability for humans to do remarkable things. Like, for instance, some of you may be familiar with this comet that's gone around, and so NASA scientists put a probe on it and a satellite. So to actually put a satellite in this probe to connect with this comet, I think is remarkable. To send a satellite to orbit Pluto, that's 10 billion kilometers away. It takes 9.5 years to get out there. Remarkable, absolutely remarkable. I mean, the mathematics that go into planning for something like that. At the same time, to see the ability for humans to destroy one another. And I think many of us have been deeply moved by what happened in Paris. To think if I went to a restaurant or a cafe or a concert, I could be slaughtered. So to see the tensions of what people can do to each other, to do remarkably scientific wonders, and then to be so brutal to one another. Now that was about 8 days ago. And so 11 days ago we celebrated Remembrance Day. So when we commemorate the horrors of war, specifically the end of World War I, and nonetheless to see the remarkable acts of mercy of soldiers who through valor and the sacrifice of their own lives have brought peace to the world. Now, great people are never made, they're not born, in fact, they're made. And so it's often ordinary people who come under great circumstances that make them great. One example of this is that we celebrate this anniversary from 75 years ago. So on May the 26th, 1940, was the Battle of Dunkirk. So what happened by this point is that Nazi troops had swept through Central and Western Europe. And so the 330,000 soldiers were in this little French port called Dunkirk. And the only place they had to go was into the English Channel. And so the British Navy, the superior naval force in the world, didn't have ships small enough to actually shuttle people back and forth. And so they were so distraught by what was going to happen that they were on the radios listening to the imminent slaughter of these hundreds of thousands of soldiers. So many nonetheless were struck by what was going on and said, what can I do to help? And so what happened was that fishermen, people who had yachts, and even little motorboats decided, hey, we can help. We'll be part of what's called the Bathtub Navy. So what they ended up doing is shuttling people back and forth between England and France in order to rescue all these troops. Now they were under great circumstances of mines that were in the English Channel. They were very, very scared of German U-boats and submarines who were there to attack. They also had the German Luftwaffe, the Air Force of the Germans, were ready to bombard all these little ships. But nonetheless, they were remarkably courageous and merciful to say, well, I'm going to help. I'm going to help bring these troops in. So day and night, they went between England and France in order to rescue all these troops. And so much so that by mid-June of 1940, Winston Churchill had said, you know, if this British Empire lasts 1,000 years, people will say this was Britain's finest hour, this Battle of Dunkirk, to rescue 338,000 troops, which therefore enabled the British forces to continue fighting against Nazism, and eventually by 1945 they conquered the Nazis. So these little fishing boats, this Bathtub Navy, through their act of mercy, brought peace to Europe. Likewise with us, when we act mercifully like as Christ the King, we bring His peace into the world. First reading today was taken from the book of the prophet Daniel. And we read about the prophet Daniel only 4 times in the 3-year cycle of our readings for Sunday. So we read about Daniel last week, today, for the Feast of Trinity Sunday, and also the Feast of the Transfiguration. So Daniel was written specifically for the Jewish people experiencing the brutality of the Greek Empire. So specifically there was a gentleman by the name of Antiochus IV Epiphanes who ruled over Israel. And he wanted to bring unity to the people, but in a Greek style. He didn't care anything about the Jewish people. And so he slaughtered any Jews who wanted to follow their Jewish traditions. And so Daniel was written specifically to encourage people, hey, it's okay. Even though you're experiencing great tribulation, the Lord is with you. And so the first 6 chapters of the book of the prophet Daniel Or with Daniel, the various stories of him having to undergo great trials. We know about Daniel in the lion's den. We know about Daniel in the furnace. And so the next half of the book of the prophet Daniel speaks about these visions that Daniel has had about Christ, about God coming to save his people, the Son of Man. And so we encounter this Son of Man who, as Daniel shares in this vision today, of coming in, who will be served by everyone, whose kingdom will never end. And so this is a part of a style of literature called apocalyptic literature. Of course, Revelation is the most famous version of that we have in the Bible. And so it's really bringing this style to encourage the people experience remarkably trying circumstances to keep the faith. It's like something many people feel when things get bad. Where is God in all this? But these writers are really saying to people, hey, it's okay. The Lord is with you. Everything's going to be okay. That God will ultimately triumph. And so for Daniel, the Son of Man will come and bring his kingdom anew, a kingdom that will never end. So is this actually fulfilled? Of course, for us as Christians, we would say yes, in the very person of Jesus. So much so that the title that Jesus gives himself, the Son of Man, in the Gospels is most used. 78 times in the Gospels, Jesus refers to himself as a Son of Man, which is almost like another way of saying the Messiah, the one who is going to bring salvation to his people. Now, in the time of Jesus, the Jews were expecting a military leader, like the prophet Zechariah kind of promises that a new king will come and will bring his salvation to the people through military force. But then when they see that Jesus is this very simple carpenter's son from Nazareth, this can't be the Messiah. Maybe some people expected a king would be like a philosopher king who would bring great wisdom to the people. But it wasn't so. It was a king of a different sort, who ultimately would be a king on a throne of a cross, who would lay down his life, the ultimate symbol of mercy, of bringing a kingdom by his example of love, to therefore bring renewal and bring a new kingdom to fruition by his sacrifice. So by Christ's merciful sacrifice, he has shown himself as the King of the universe. Now, when we think about what happened in Paris, we think about Remembrance Day and the world wars that think, well, does life get any better? Does life get any easier? Well, it's never been the case. In fact, we celebrate Christ the King feast specifically because of a Pope in 1925. So it was Pope Pius XI, who in 1925 saw what was going on in the world. What happened when a world did not have Christ the King at the center of their own hearts, of their own nations, of their own lives. Where he himself experienced the ravages of World War I. I mean, World War I was called the Great War, the war to end all wars. Well, did anybody win in World War I? 18 years after the conclusion of World War I become World War II. So Pius XI said, there's got to be a way to alleviate war. We put Christ at the center of our lives. Also with World War I, that Christian nations were fighting against one another, and the horrors of that, with using gas and other means of destroying one another. He said, this is crazy. He also saw what was happening in the Soviet Union with the rise of communism, that a nation was specifically godless in its ideology. He was stunned by that. And so this Feast of Christ the King, you want to get people to reflect upon the importance of having the Christ as the center of their lives. The King of Peace, the King of Mercy. And almost saying, if you want peace in your world, you must have peace in your heart. And that peace can only come from Christ the King. And for Pius XI, he wanted to have this date as the conclusion of the liturgical year, and at the end of the years, because all the mysteries of our faith are summed up ultimately that Christ is the King of the universe. He rules over all. Now what about us? Do we really have Christ at the center of our lives? Do we feel peace? There will never be peace in the world if there's not peace in our hearts. And I think for us to really appreciate, well, if we have peace, Christ reigning in our lives, hey, there'll be peace in the world. And I think we're, in fact, the luckiest people on the face of the earth. I mean, how often we hear in the Beatitudes, blessed are the peacemakers, from Scripture. So every Sunday we gather to hear the words of Scripture, to remind ourselves of our dignity and also our duty to be peacemakers. We also have the Eucharist, that Christ the King comes into our very bodies in the form of food to then give us the strength to be people of mercy. And so I think it's very ironic that as we celebrate Remembrance Day, we also reflect upon what happened in Paris and other parts of the world where there's been terror, that Pope Francis asked the Church to celebrate a year of mercy, which begins on December the 8th, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, and then concludes with with Christ the King next year. And so for Pope Francis, he wants people to re-encounter God's mercy in their lives, to encounter the personal love that God has for them. And in turn, he wants the Church to share that with others who've never encountered God's mercy, and say, hey, here's God's mercy for you. Here's an example through my life, so we can bring peace and unity to the world. And so in Matthew chapter 25, Jesus says at the end of the world, when he ultimately sits enthroned to judge the world, and looking at how people have used their time, talent, and treasure to build up God's kingdom, he says, how have you loved the sick, the imprisoned, the thirsty, the hungry, and the stranger? And he says, when you've done this to the least of my brothers and sisters, you've done it to me. So as we are nourished by sacred word, by the Eucharist, let's be instruments of mercy, reminding ourselves, hey, Christ is the center of my life, and now I want to bring his kingdom to come, because he needs us. Just as the bathtub Navy saved 338,000 troops, without those troops, inevitably Hitler would have taken over England, and therefore most likely the whole world. And so these little boats, fishing boats, probably tugboats, yachts, and motorboats, brought all these little people back to safety by the little acts of mercy. And so this week, let's be people of mercy, to do little things with great love, as Mother Teresa says, to show the world that Christ is the King of the universe by how we share his acts of mercy with the world.